Our next author is Ernest Hemingway, so get ready to learn some cool stuff about this awesome dude. Hemingway was born in 1899, so while that was a little bit ago, you'll see he was dealing with some things we're still talking about in this country today. His family was in the upper middle class in Oak Park, Illinois, which is a really conservative place, and they had these values of strong religion, hard work, physical fitness, and self determination. And they believed that if you adhered to those things, you would be ensured success in whatever you wanted to do. Does that sound familiar? Cough, cough, like the American dream, maybe? His dad was a doctor, so he was making those big bucks, and his mom was a singer, and she was really well read. And he was part of a pretty big family with four sisters and one brother. But he has been quoted as describing his hometown as wide lawns and narrow minds. So that tells you a little bit about his feelings towards the conservative people there and their ideas about the world. But at the end of the day, he just liked being outdoors, hunting and fishing with his dad, which you'll see inspired a lot of his short stories. But his mother was also exposing him to music and literature, keeping him well rounded. When he was 18, he tried to enlist in the army, but he couldn't because he had a bad eye. So instead, he joined as a Red Cross ambulance driver because he still really wanted to get in on the action. You gotta think, back then, people were being sold the idea that war was honorable and courageous and that you'd be respected for fighting for your country. So he wanted to be a part of that. And after that, he hunted big game in Africa. So he was out there hunting lions and he went on fishing expeditions around Cuba, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But writing had really always been a big part of his life, and he continued by being a journalist in the Spanish Civil War and World War II. But ultimately, he was injured a lot and had like over a dozen brain injuries. But both the hunting and his time in and around war become subjects and themes in his later work. He's trying to get into the war effort, and literally his first day on the job as an ambulance driver, there's an explosion, and he had to carry dead people and body parts to a makeshift morgue. If that doesn't mess with your head, I don't know what will. But not only did he have to witness and deal with other people's injuries, he was injured a number of times. I mean, we just talked about his over a dozen brain injuries, but he also was in three car crashes, two plane crashes, and then he had to have 237 little steel pieces taken out of his body. Is this dude a cat? Because he's got 9 lives or something. But he has a little claim to fame that everyone wants, you know. He was one of the first Americans to be injured in the war. And obviously, these things had a big impact on his life and his writing. So I don't know if you guys have caught on by now, but this dude is intense. He hunted sharks, not with fishing nets or, I don't know, something you usually fish with, but with machine guns. He survived not one, but two plane crashes in back to back days. He was out hunting lions in Africa. They're the king of the jungle. I don't know if you know. And then I'm not sure if you know how intense this next one is, but Homeboy was literally hunting German submarines off the Cuban coast. Who does that? And he also allegedly, but probably, helped liberate a French bar and was described as being on a one man mission to liberate the famous bar at the Ritz Hotel from the Germans. And then, after succeeding, he stayed there drinking apparently 51 martinis, which is a lot. And all this time in Cuba, he was inevitably thought to be friends with Fidel Castro, you know, the Cuban dictator who suppressed his people for a number of years. Yeah, that guy. But enough about him and his crazy lifestyle. We're going to get into his writing style. It's short and clear, no long, drawn out sentences. He got his style from being a newspaper writer, where he had to get straight to the point to deliver his stories. You know, there's only so much room in the paper, so you got to get to the point and get there quickly. So, due to that, he writes under the iceberg principle, stating, I always try to write on the principle of the iceberg. There is 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows. Anything you know, you can eliminate, and it only strengthens your iceberg. So he basically believed that the deeper meaning of a story should not be evident on the surface, but should shine through implicitly. His writing style isn't super complex. Like, in terms of word choice and sentence structure, it's really straightforward. This is a little bit deceptive, though, because it seems really simple on the surface. This is exactly what he meant by the iceberg principle, because you only see 1/8 of the story if you're just reading it on a surface level, while the rest is below the surface, that other 7/8. This is where I'm going to need your little literary analysis brains to turn all the way up so you can go deep in these stories to see more than just that top portion, that top 1/8 of the story, that surface level understanding. I'm going to need you to dig deeper. All right, so we touched on who Hemingway is as a person, his writing style, but since we're not in class and we can't do the normal research portion before the text, I'm going to provide you with some need to know information that will provide context for Hemingway's writing and the content of the short stories. You'll need to know about the Lost Generation, who they are, what that even means, some of the stuff that was happening in World War I, the conditions of the warfare, the treatment of the soldiers. You'll need to know about what was going on in America during Hemingway's time that would have impacted his writing. And we're also going to touch on the inequality in America, like who it impacted and what it spurred. That term, lost generation, it describes a group of American writers that were rebelling against the social expectations of post-World War I America. They had been to war, they'd seen tragedy, they lived in a time of economic depression, and many of them lost faith in traditional values, patriotism, and ideas of courage, masculinity, materialism. They'd lost faith in the American dream. So a number of intellectuals, poets, artists, and writers, they ended up leaving America. They went to Paris instead because they rejected so many of America's ideals. And they were full of youthful idealism and sought the meaning of life, drank excessively, had a lot of love affairs, and created some of the finest American literature to date. Something really important of note about the Lost Generation is the conflict that they had with the older generation. The older generation valued materialism and thought that it could be obtained by working really hard, but this conflicted with what the Lost Generation had seen. They weren't getting the fair, equal pay that they deserved. They were working hard but not seeing a payoff that was supposed to be coming with the American dream. The older generation said that the lost generation would be responsible for closing the book on human progress, as they were engaged in unchristian behaviors like drinking, firm handshakes, and rejected the typical American ideals. But war had a big impression on the young people that the older generation just couldn't understand. They had been told they were going to be doing this great thing for their country and the world, only to see pointless death and suffering that really impacted them and the way they viewed the world. Speaking of the war, World War One was pretty bad. I mean, most wars are bad, but World War One is often referred to as the most gruesome war, and it was just absolute chaos. So, trench warfare was really common throughout this war, and trenches are long, narrow ditches that are dug into the ground, and soldiers live here. And they stayed in these trenches for weeks. They were super unsanitary, and there was tons of disease like trench foot, trench fever, and loads of infection. And this type of warfare led to so many casualties, and nothing like this had ever been seen before in terms of war. And it wasn't only the soldiers that were being impacted. Millions of innocent civilians across Europe were uprooted. Their homes and lives were wiped out by the path of war. And civilians often became military targets because they were just out there. And families were torn apart because the men got drafted to war. So women had to become providers for their family. So people are without their husbands, kids are without their fathers. And the civilians were also making sacrifices. A lot of them were drafted or they were forced to work for the country's war effort in some way, shape, or form. So, the mental impacts of this war were also incredibly devastating. Thousands of women and children felt effects of post traumatic stress disorder because they were also exposed to the traumas of war, even if they weren't out there fighting. The families, like I said, had been torn apart, and many of them, the fathers often died in the war, leaving the families to fend for themselves. Faith deteriorated because they couldn't believe that a God would allow this to happen. And then also, people lost faith in their governments too, because how could they be thinking that they were going to be protected by their governments when such chaos had ensued? And then when the soldiers that were fortunate enough to come home, when they did make it home, they were incredibly misunderstood. They were expected to pick up their lives where they had left off, and they were expected to return to society's normalcies, expectations, and traditions, even though they had just been involved in something super traumatic. And thousands of soldiers flooded the unemployment market, and a social class dictated the quality of your treatment. And there was like little help available, especially for people who were poor before the war. They came back and were still poor, even though they had just fought for their country. And they also just really had nobody to talk to or no one to understand them, because civilians that had been back in America, they had no real comprehension of what war was like. This is basically just a crazy time in American history. A lot of people are super unhappy during this time. There's a ton of different people who had just gone away and fought for their country, but were coming back to a place that did not respect them or treat them equally. There were tons of riots, and there were 36 of them between 1910 and 1927. They centered around race, education, gender, and also labor rights and working conditions. A couple of noteworthy riots, so the Chicago riots, or Red Summer, they started when a young African American boy drifted into an informally segregated white swimming area at the beach and was killed. So it wasn't even like he was not supposed to be over there by law. It was just informally understood that white people were just swimming in that area, and he just happened to go into the wrong area, apparently. So somewhere between 1 and 2,000 African Americans lost their homes in this 5-day riot, and 38 people were killed. Then in a different kind of riot, this one centered around labor rights and working conditions, the Wheatland Hop Riot. Basically, too many people showed up for not enough jobs, leading to really, really slashed wages. And too many people also meant that there weren't enough facilities, and there were often human feces and waste overflowing and flies all around. There was no running water, terrible wages, and a ton of lies and deceit, which led to unrest until a riot ultimately broke out, with workers demanding better conditions. This led to a fight between workers and the police. So at this time, people are just restless, unhappy, and social structures are changing. Fights are occurring because some people want things to stay the same, but some people really want them to change, and there's a big clash between those two groups. And violence is often being met with more violence, which isn't accomplishing anything. Some of the groups that are getting treated unfairly during this time are African Americans, Native Americans, and women. So, with African Americans, the Jim Crow laws are still in effect in the South. So, everything is segregated. Violence against African Americans is at an all time high. It's really hard for them to find employment. And even when they do get employed, they're given lower pay. There are people who still are believing in these differences of racial intelligence, thinking that African Americans aren't on par with white people. And there's a disproportionate amount of African Americans being drafted. There's more of them being drafted than whites, and the army is still segregated at this point too. And because of some of these race riots like Red Summer, they are being seen as a threat because white people are thinking that they may militarize and be a threat to them, but we know that that's crazy. So then also life for Native Americans, they were forced to assimilate by the government. They had to assimilate their religion, their education, their workforce, when we know their way of life is drastically different from what Europeans brought over from Britain when they invaded the land. The Native Americans struggled with disease, they had short life expectancy, and this is because they weren't allowed access to government programs or even hospitals. They weren't even allowed to become citizens until much later and weren't given full citizen rights. For women, there's also a struggle. Gender roles are still extremely rigid. They need to find a husband, provide him a child, take care of the house. Those that did have jobs, they weren't getting paid an equal amount, something we're still struggling with. But they are trying to make waves and get some ground with breaking stereotypes. They fight for the right to vote and are granted that through the 19th Amendment. There's the flapper movement where women are fighting some of those strict gender roles, and they're trying to fight those stereotypes that women couldn't work as hard or be as intelligent as men, especially since while the men were away in war, they had taken over jobs that had been previously done by them. So they're trying to end that stigma of these differences between men and women and these roles that they should be playing. You have learned some information about Ernest Hemingway, who he is, what his writing style is like, what the world was like when he was writing and growing up, and what shaped him, and what themes and content we may be getting in his short stories. So, with that information, make sure that you go ahead and answer those 5 questions associated with assignment 3. And if you have listened to this whole presentation, the answer to question number 5 is C. The question is a little bit silly, but I just want to make sure that you are getting all the information that you need. So thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.